Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome to yet another panel of Decolonize Hellas Symposium, the first symposium, nomadic and hybrid. I'm Nikolas Kosmatopoulos. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology and politics in the American University of Beirut. And I'm sitting here alone, but hopefully I'm not going to be alone too long. I'm waiting to welcome our guests today on the panel called From Merchants to Tycoons, the Greek Shipping Industry in Ottomanism, Colonialism, and Capitalism. This is a panel that aims to just scratch the surface of a very huge discussion about the place of Greek shipping merchants today. But we are very lucky to have perhaps the most suitable and the most well-placed researchers to do this scratching. I'm saying scratching because the theme is necessarily vast as the sea itself. It's very difficult to even claim that we can scratch more than the surface today, but we will try to discuss with three acclaimed historians, one more acclaimed than the other, about the place of colonialism and decolonialism in the study of the sea, and especially the historical study of the Mediterranean, focus on Greek shippers and shipping magnates. I had the honor to organize this panel. I myself, I'm very much interested in the politics of the sea. I realized while studying the topic that one cannot understand much about the sea today if one doesn't look in the past. And the past has very much given me a lot of chance looking at the past of maritime capitalism. Has given me a lot of chance to encounter the work of our guests today. The panel is an ambitious one in the sense that we have declared the aim to discuss Greek shipping through a macro-historical view, if you wish, over several centuries. But at the same time, I think this is actually a justified ambition because there are more and more research, there's more research coming out that takes this macro-historical view. There is, of course, research that refers to the development and the beginning of capitalism at sea. There is a lot of interesting research on the macroeconomic contours of merchant colonialism, circulational colonialism, as they call it, and then we move on to more recent work on capitalism in the post-world era. Critical logistics is also a very important work. We also talked in the panel that we had this morning about laboring in the sea, at sea, with anthropologists and other researchers about the question of labor and how one approaches labor at sea. One of the discussion points that came out was that methodologically speaking, it is a kind of black hole. It is becoming extremely difficult to do research on this topic, not just because the sea is far away from the land, and people tend to forget that there are many things happening out there that are very important with things happening here, that the sea is becoming extremely relevant to trade. I mean, that has always been the case, but today, even more so. More than 80% of today's merchandise moves through the sea. The sea is also very important gradually in discussions about the environment, climate change. The seas are rising, and that's a very, very concerning phenomenon. But generally speaking, the seas has also very much been always at the center of great developments in the macro-historical sense. That's why we decided to open the frame as broad as we can, and we tackle the place of Greek shipping in Ottomanism, colonialism, and capitalism. Again, this sounds extremely like a hubris. Theoretically speaking, one cannot even claim to cover this vast amount of time and space in these three systems. But we try to do what we do with other panels in this conference, just scratch the surface, place out a promise, and then hopefully live up to the promise in a second and a third iteration of the same discussions. So I'm very happy today to have with me, not here, that's sad that I don't have them here, but online, joining me from, I think, the East Coast of the United States of America, Molly Green. Hello, Molly. Welcome. Nice to see you over the screen. And I will present also Molly Green after I see everybody else, or maybe I should just present Molly first and then move to the second presenter, or can we actually have them all together showing? So I think it's more decent to... Μπορούμε να τους βάλουμε όλους μαζί σε μία οθόνη. Γίνεται.
Η φωνή μπορούμε να ανοίξουμε
Gelina
παραπάνω.
also. Very happy to see Gelina.
Παραπάνω, δεν σε ακούμε πολύ μακρινά.
I cannot really scream. I'm not supposed to. δεν με ακούει, λέει. Δεν ξέρω γιατί.
Σε ακούμε, αλλά σε ακούμε πολύ μακρινά.
Μακρινά. Μας χωρίζει ένα Αιγαίο. Τι να πει και η Μόλι, δηλαδή.
Μας χωρίζει... Είμαι στο Βερολίνο αυτή τη στιγμή. Σήμερα.
Μας χωρίζουν οι Άλπεις. Οπότε όλα εξηγούνται. Gelina, we are very happy to have you on board. And this is a wonderful background also. Yours also, it's a beautiful background. And I think I'm going to be asking if we can also have Sakis Gkekas, the third participant today. Is he? Hi, Sakis.
Hello.
Welcome. So nice to have you on board. And thank you for accepting our invitation. So I'll say a few words about the speakers. Sakis is also kind of a speaker today, but he's mostly, I guess, having two hats, coordinating, and also he has also many things to say about the topic. But I will start with Molly. Molly Green studies the history of Mediterranean basin, the Ottoman Empire, and the Greek world. Her interests include the social and economic history of the Ottoman Empire, the experience of Greeks under the Ottoman rule, and the early modern Mediterranean. Her first book, A Shared World, Christians and Muslims in the Early Modern Mediterranean, came out in 2000, examines the transition from Venetian to Ottoman rule on the island of Crete, which the Ottomans conquered in 1669, challenging the assumption of a radical rupture with the arrival of the Ottomans. Green shows that the population of Crete had been drawn into the Ottoman world long before the conquest, and that important continuities link the Venetian and the Ottoman periods. Her second book, Catholic Pirates and Greek Merchants and Maritime History of the Mediterranean, 1450 to 1700, was published in 2010 and was a co-winner of the, something happened, of the Runciman Award for that year. At the center of the book is the relationship between Catholic piracy and Greek commerce in the early modern Mediterranean. She has a third book published in 2015, the Edinburgh History of the Greeks, the Ottoman Empire, between 1453 and 1768, also shortlisted for the Runciman Award. Gelina Charlafti is a historian. She's a director of the Institute of Mediterranean Studies of the Foundation of Research and Technology since 2017, a professor of maritime history in the Department of History at the Ionian University. She has graduated from the University of Athens and has completed her graduate studies in the universities of Cambridge and Oxford. She was president of the International Maritime Economic History Association and a visiting fellow at All Souls College in Oxford and a visiting scholar in Harvard Business School. She was also a visiting professor in the Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada and research fellow in the Greenwich University in London. Her research interests are in maritime history, economic and social history, business history, global history, and diaspora history. He has published more than 25 books in English, Canadian and Greek publishing houses also, and many articles on the maritime history. So Sakis, Gkekas, is an associate professor and the Hellenic Heritage Foundation Chair in Modern Greek History at York University in Toronto. He has written on the Ionian Islands under British rule. His latest book, Xenocracy, Economy, Society and State in the Ionian Islands, came out in 2017. Has written also the book has been also published in Greek recently, Xenocratia, Οικονομία, Κοινωνία και Κράτος στα Επτάνησα. He has also written another book on Δαμασκηνιά, Βιντελούτσι, ένα χωριό στο χώρο και στο χρόνο. So welcome everyone, and thank you for everyone who's here in Botanikos. Without further ado, I'm going to open the discussion. We decided, I think, with Sakis to have a kind of a more of a dialogical form in this discussion rather than papers. So I'll give the floor to Sakis to start off the conversation and welcome you all here today. Looking forward to the discussion.
Nikola, Gelina, Molly, I think as we discussed earlier before going online, perhaps Gelina could start first and have some sort of broader comments. She's the really expert on the history of shipping and maritime history, which I think will set the ground quite nicely for the discussion.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and hi, Nikolas. Hello to everybody in Botanikos, and I wish I was there. I'm very happy to be in this panel. Yes, it is not a paper, and certainly I'm not going to send you to tell you 30 years of research about Greek shipping. But I'm going to say a few things and then put down some thoughts as historians, as a historian about what I understand or not understand or doubt about decolonized Hellas. So Greeks as Ottoman and Venetian subjects during the early modern period, and very distinctively since the 18th century, were the main seafarers, ship owners, seamen of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, connecting East and West. And this has been their position for centuries. Somewhere, they were always somewhere between West and the rest, to use the more modern, one of the main issues of in post-colonialism or way to say Western Europe and the West and the developing or underdeveloped world. The Greeks continued from the 18th century, continued in the 19th century, based on Greek islands of the Aegean and Ionian seas under any state, and on the one side, and on the diaspora merchant communities on the other side. These were the so-called merchant colonies, or eborικές παροικίες. And they formed a system. They formed a system by which the shipping companies of the islands, of 40 islands, of the 120 inhabited, provided transport, low-cost transport services by bringing cargoes that the big diaspora merchants of the Black Sea provided to the West. And this culminated during the era of Industrial Revolution, and they brought grain mainly to the industrialized Europe. So they formed a very large merchant fleet, a merchant fleet which was already very big, about 1,000 sailing ships on the eve of the Greek Revolution. And this was their wealth and their connections as well with the merchant colonies of Greeks from Odessa to Amsterdam. Greek merchant ships became parts of them became Greek Navy during the Greek Revolution, and the largest part also continued in privateering and in merchanting during the Greek Revolution. After the Greek Revolution, it was still the ships and these maritime centers, the islands that provided, that were still flourishing, continuing to trade in the between the Western Mediterranean, between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean. So by the beginning of the 20th century, by the eve of the First World War, the small Greek state had the 9th merchant fleet in the world. And then in about 50 or 60 years, by the 1970s, Greeks owned the biggest merchant fleet in the world, and they do so in the last 50 years. Okay, they have the largest fleet, more than the United States, the Germans, the Japanese, the Chinese, and so on. So the Greek case and its relation of the businessmen to the sea is rather peculiar. Usually a big colonial power is a maritime power. We are not a colonial power, but we are a maritime power. And how is that? And then you go back and you think Greeks were colonized by the Ottomans. They revolted to decolonize themselves. They became a weak peripheral country that gradually took its place to the West by making as well this big merchant fleet, but also its economy. So where is Greece? Okay. Again, I find it between the West and the rest. The title of this conference, Decolonize Alas, is provocative. And to my most probably traditional historical training, can be insulting. Maybe because I do not understand what it means, or I'll try to understand by reading post-colonialism, because it indicates on the one hand a lack of historical perspective, I find. Modern Greece, despite its glorious past, was on the margins of the West until the last third of the 20th century. And it is since the 1980s that we finally have had an a greater economic achievement to be part of the group of developed countries. Until then, until the 1980s, it was always felt that it was not in the West. There are still Greeks that think we do not belong in Europe. It's because they think it's Western Europe, and we're not Western Europe. We're not West. My generation, I was born in the 1950s, is probably the last that was brought up to be ashamed of our Oriental past, okay? I was brought up to be ashamed of this traditional culture, you know, the Amanes, the Rebetica, the whatever. And it was at Cambridge and Oxford that I got into terms with that. So this is where I became proud of the tradition of my country, but it was also in Greece that things were moving in a different direction. So decolonize, alas. Why is it post-colonialism relevant today in alas? Do we have a colonial attitude? According to Robert Young, and I quote here, post-colonialism claims the rights of people on this earth to the same material and cultural well-being. The reality, though, is that the world today is a world of inequality, and much of the difference falls across the broad division between people of the West and those of the non-West. But this is exactly the same Marxist ideology of the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s of my youth and my studies. You know, Immanuel Wallerstein, Center Periphery, Gunther Frank, developed, underdeveloped, first, second, third world, okay? The Marxist socialist vision of the equality of the people is post-colonialism in a way. It's άλλαξε ο Μανολιός και έβαλε τα ρούχα του αλλιώς. I won't translate this. Are we to call again Greek merchants and ship owners of the 18th, 19th, 20th century, as Poulandzas and Mouzelis called them, agents of capitalism, Trojan horses of imperialism that westernized and colonized Greeks? So decolonize, alas? Maybe you're right, on the other hand. We do need to rethink. We have become West. We have forgotten the 1.5 million refugees of 1922, or the fact that Greek immigrants in the United States or Canada or Australia were second-class people, okay? And they were regarded as we today in Greece regard Somalis, Afghans, Pakistanis, or Syrian refugees. So if decolonize, alas, means to elaborate in the subaltern, subordinated classes and peoples to remember the other, then yes, I think we need it. The fact is that we became part of the West largely because of the sea in the modern era. So this is just a few thoughts that I just wanted to share with you, and we can go on. I will talk a little bit later about maritime history. With Nikolas, we had discussed how much, to what extent does we can talk about a post-colonial turn in the maritime history. Now, I think maritime history can go well with post-colonial history, with post-colonialism, from the point of view that when you talk about history of the sea, okay, you do not talk about a history of states. You have the sea in the middle. So you talk about the European coast, you talk about the African coast, you talk about the Asian coast. So we have in maritime history, we have the uses of the sea, and we can, and these tools can be combined well with a different view or be, yes. So when in the maritime history, you have the unit in the middle. You have the sea to study, and you study on the sea, navigation, ships, voyages, war, piracy. In the sea, about the sources of the sea. Around the sea, maritime communities, port cities, and so on. Because of the sea, there you have the colonial powers, but also maritime transport systems and so on. And inspiration from the sea, so in literature, art, music, and so on. So I will stop here because I put many things in the basket, and we can open up the discussion on these issues.
Thank you very much, Gelina. I think this is quite a lot, and it's very, very stimulating. Molly, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be here and to be on such a distinguished panel. Yeah, I was worried that I wouldn't have much to say, but listening to Gelina, I'm going to try and Professor Charlafti, so I'm going to try and be brief. Let's take about the big issue of West versus East, which of course is vital to any project of decolonization. I'm hoping, I'm not very hopeful, but I'm hoping that our current pretty terrible moment at least might have the benefit of finally tearing down this long-standing binary of West versus East. And I don't mean in the old Marxist sense of, all the peoples of the world are united, because they certainly aren't. But when you have in the United States American politicians who on the right, who admire Viktor Orban in Hungary, when you have American politicians who are more sympathetic to Russia than they are to, say, France. All of these, and the populism across the globe, when you have the travesty of the refugee situation in Europe, and sort of all of this discussion of Western values rings more and more hollow. I'm hoping that this idea of something called the West, which is distinct from the East, might finally break down. And I think for a long time, the idea of the West has continued to be very powerful despite the reality of the West, right? We know that in the 1920s, Ataturk ushered in co-education in Turkey, the new state of Turkey, because that was what it meant to be modern and to be Western. Whereas the university I teach at, Princeton, did not admit women until 1969. Okay, so there's this idea of the West that's not the reality of the West. Okay, that's on big stuff. Professor Charlafti's talked about the fact that when you talk about the sea, you do not talk about the state. Here, I just want to give a few perspectives from those of us who are more familiar with trends in pre-modern Mediterranean history and in Ottoman history. So when you talk about the sea, you do not talk about the state. That is absolutely the impetus behind really the soaring interest in Mediterranean history. It's an attempt to get away, not so much from colonialism and capitalism, which are not terms used a lot right now in Mediterranean studies, but to get away from Eurocentrism. And to open up a space, the Mediterranean, that isn't dominated by Europe. This has proved hard to do in practice. At conferences on the Mediterranean, people from the Arab world, from the Muslim world, are routinely absent. Sometimes they can't get visas to come to conferences, so that tells you something. And I think there are these endless discussions, which I think have kind of run their course of whether the Mediterranean is a proper object of study, and what is the Mediterranean and how far does it extend and so forth. And is the Mediterranean itself a colonial term, right? Because the people in the Arab Mediterranean world, the Ottoman world, did not use the term Mediterranean until the 19th century. This is very much a sort of a Greco-Roman term. To this day, there still is not a single journal in the Arabic language with the word Mediterranean in its focus. So there's lots and lots of discussions about whether the Mediterranean itself, the word, is a colonial imposition. Let me see. Other things that I could talk about. In Ottoman studies is kind of going in the different, so I talked about Mediterranean studies, which very much is interested in the sea, not just for itself, but as a way of getting away from Eurocentric categories. Ottomanists have gone in a rather different direction, and that is because historically the historiographical conclusion has been that the Ottomans were absent from the sea, right? And this goes from sort of close to racist characterizations that the Turks were a people of the steppe and could not, could never adapt themselves to the sea, to more sort of limited and empirical observations, such as the undoubted decline of the Ottoman Navy after the 16th century. I remember when I was in graduate school, Charles Issaoui's Economic History of the Middle East said, from the Crusades on, the Mediterranean became a Christian sea. So Ottomanists have actually kind of trying to bring the state back in comparison to Mediterranean studies. And I'm thinking of work by Joshua White or by Michael Talbot that says, yes, the Ottomans were not able sort of to put forth a navy from the 17th century on to provide security. But they were relevant and they responded to piracy, to violence. And we know this because many petitioners turned to the Ottoman courts for relief. They mounted a legal response, and Michael Talbot has shown that during the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, which is often just told as a story of sort of the blooming of Greek shipping as a neutral force, that in fact the French routinely went to the Ottoman port in Istanbul to complain about British attacks on their shipping, and the Ottomans put pressure on the British, and the British had to compensate the French. So there is sort of that is the trend in Ottoman maritime history writing. The other trend in Ottoman history writing is, and I'd be very interested to speak with Professor Charlafti more about this, is to really push against the idea of 1830 being the beginning of modern Greek history, and we're not going to hear anything more about the Ottomans. Professor Charlafti spoke about the term diaspora. I don't know if I would use that term because it implies that the new state, which was small and quite weak, is the natural center. There was a lot of Greek emigration to the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, okay? Both by Greeks who were based in Greece and by Ottoman Greeks who went to Greece and got a passport and went back, right, which gave them incredible advantages. In fact, Berke Torulu at Bilkent University has made a very persuasive argument, which will be coming out soon. I think he already had an article in the Journal of Modern Greek Studies saying that I forget what the Ottomans called them, but the alienated Greeks, right? Greeks who, as far as the Ottomans were concerned, were really Ottomans, but had a Greek passport, were so many that it was actually the Greeks that kicked off the whole Ottoman project of Ottomanism, of sort of trying to define who an Ottoman was. And it wasn't so much about generating sort of a solidarity, but weeding out who was and was not Ottoman. So when we say that diaspora, is that really the case? I mean, how central the Greek state was central in terms of passports, but you have this just, really deep engagement with the Ottomans and the Ottoman Empire all the way up to the end. So that's another area, which brings up the whole question of like, where is the Greek state in the story of Greek shipping? So, Ottoman stuff brings this up. Even going further back, one of the things I can say about shipping is that Greek shipping, as Professor Charlafti has always said, has been around forever. But when I first started doing my work, it was still, I remember reading the book, The Greek Merchant Marine, and talked about how in Idra, and it was always Idra, Setsis, and Sarah, because they were so big in the revolution, how in the 18th century they started sort of tentatively constructing boats and sailing around the island. In fact, Greek shipping goes way back. It's everywhere, and it's in places that we wouldn't always recognize as Greek, right? So remember, there isn't a Greek state. So Venetian historians have shown that Venetian merchants in London in the 16th century, they were Greek, but they're called Venetian because they had Venetian citizenship or Venetian status, whatever you want to call it. So there's the whole relationship of there's the whole question of the relationship between the Greek state and Greek shipping. I have some things to say about cosmopolitanism. We can talk about that if people want. A couple of things that Professor Kosmatopoulos brought up that I want to say. I wish we had, at least for the pre-modern period, of course, Professor Charlafti has done this for the modern period. It's striking how we are generally missing a history of sailors in the Mediterranean. When I teach my pre-modern Mediterranean course, there's really nothing I can give people. There is some stuff on English sailors, but sort of Mediterranean sailors, no, as compared to, let's say, the Atlantic, in which there are just tons and tons of histories of Atlantic sailors and kind of the international working class that is in the Atlantic, and I'm not quite sure about the Pacific. So we are missing that. We're also missing an environmental history of the Mediterranean, not an environmental history of the Mediterranean region. We have that, okay, but that is a history of the land. Mediterranean history is still written very much as a history of when we think about what the Mediterranean is, it's very much a surface with routes that ships go across. Except for a little bit about sponge diving, we have very little about the sea itself. This compares to, say, the Atlantic, where you can read tons of stuff on, say, cod fishing and what happened to fish, the prevalence of fish over many centuries. So the environmental history of the Mediterranean Sea itself, what was the result of the digging of the Suez Canal? How did it change I don't even know the terms, but the biochemical nature of the water in the Mediterranean? We are completely lacking that. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, can I respond, or?
Sure.
Sakis? Yes.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. So I will respond on the diaspora case and the seamen. When I say diaspora, I don't mean the ones in Constantinople or Smyrna or the main Ottoman Empire. I mean Odessa, Tagarok, Berdyansk, Novorossiysk, Batum, Varna, Galatz, Sulina, Trieste, Marseille, Barcelona, Malta, Amsterdam, London, Calcutta, and New York, and even 1780s, they went to Buenos Aires and Montevideo to trade. In many of these were the merchant colonies. I mean, Greeks didn't do anything different than it was the foreign merchants that dealt with the trade. But what is important here is the relation of shipping and the Greek state, and this is in the Marxist historiography of the 1970s. You had Psiroukis that brought the issue of the connection of shipping being the main artery between Greek state and the merchant colonies. Okay, and although he went in different directions, this is the core of the thing, and this is why I always talk about, and it's quite anachronistic as I do it, but even for the 18th century, about Greek-owned shipping. Okay, so it means Greeks, and we're not going to talk who is Greek, but the ones that think that are Greek, under many flags. Okay, but what they did was that they became a brand name in the Mediterranean Sea. We have in Malta, as you know very well, it is Greco they write down, okay, because they don't write Ottomano, but it is or when they go to Genova, they would have Ottomano Idrioto or Mesolongito or Kefalonito, not Veneto, okay? So it is the local dimension that is very important that is of the islands. And it is not, yes, not Hydra, Spetsa, Samsara. There are another 40 islands and very important, and which do not like Enos, okay? Enos in Thrace was and Mosconesia and Aivali or Kidonias were very important maritime places. So you have shipping. Shipping companies and that trade in the big ports, you know, they take cargoes from the Black Sea or cargoes from various places in the Eastern Mediterranean, they carry it in the Western Mediterranean and in the Northern Europe. They meet in the ports, okay? They have the same way of business, whether they are under Venice or Ionian state or afterwards the Greek state, or they are part of the Eastern Aegean and they belong to the Ottoman state, or they are Italian state, okay? But they do communicate, and so this is the beauty of studying, of having, of studying connections and people and mobility through the sea, okay? We have a glue here is the shipping business, okay? Shipping and trading. And this is what they have done very well. And you cannot understand at all Mediterranean shipping and trading if you go and analyze by state. You miss the picture. Okay, so this is the importance of the sea as studied as a unit. So you study the important ones, the non-important ones. Okay, and it's not only in the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean. Okay, and so on. So yeah, when I say diaspora, I mean beyond what was called, I think Hasiotis had called it the Orthodox East or whatever. Not, it is the ones that were in the Ottoman Empire. No, these are not diaspora. Okay, it is beyond, and also in connection. The Greek state. For the first, we have calculated, because I'm an economic historian, the money that came in the Greek economy from the 1830s to 1860s from shipping business and from shipping abroad and from the parts that were in Greece. Formed about 2/3 of the Greek καθάριστο εθνικό εισόδημα, national, yeah, of the national income, we can say. Okay, so it was a very important sector of the Greek economy, and it is still not recognized, and it is still doubted because it is not produced in Greece. This is capital that it is, they get the money abroad, beyond Greece. They don't carry the products of Greece. They are third party, they are carriers of third countries, like the Dutch were, okay? And this is how they became so big, and they became specialized in that through the sea. So this is one part. The other part is we said very, you said beautifully about the Atlantic and how important, how many wonderful studies we have about the Atlantic and about the seamen. Okay, we don't have many accounts or about the lives of seamen in the Mediterranean. We are starting to have quite a few, but it is difficult. We have one of the people that is very known is Marcus Rediker, who has written about the ships as crews, as cosmopolitan crews, or it is the prototype of proletariat, okay, international proletariat. It is true that the work at sea can be done by many nationalities because they have a certain jargon. You have a certain, movements to make with which you can use certain words. So it can work as a factory, as a place of production, which is the production is movement by sea, by people of many nationalities. And this is, but Rediker has all his examples from Britain. Now, Britain was a colonial power, definitely. It did not have enough people to manage handle its ships. So it recruited people from all its colonies, all from everywhere. But this is not how most of shipping in the world worked. European shipping, apart from the British one in the 18th or 19th century, continued up to the mid-20th century to be run by people from small communities. You have small villages, small towns that where the crews of ships come from. This happened in Sweden, in Norway, and definitely in Italy, in France, and certainly in Greece. I mean, crews up to 1950s, 1960s, even 1970s, despite the internationality, 60% were usually from the same village or from the same island. Okay, so is this the local dimension here? Okay, so it is a very interesting and different from land industry or activity, and the sea can give a lot of examples of interaction and of working together of many people with different languages and different religions and different origins, but also it is a place where people from one place, they come from one place only. So this can be beautifully studied, and we hope to do this in the Mediterranean and provide more examples. So that is and of course, very rightly, you mentioned the environment. Fishing is the other part that we hope to develop. And because the North has all these unbelievable studies on fishing, and fishing in the Mediterranean is not abundant, yes, but there is, and people lived out of it. So this is another part which the sea can provide us with more studies, and anthropologists can do a wonderful job on that as well. And this is the idea, this is why I'm here, interdisciplinarity, and find a more common ground for dialogue, and not be beautifully cocooned in our disciplines.
Thank you, Gelina. I would like to start by this point on diaspora that was brought up by both Professor Charlafti and Professor Green. And I would like to note that it's important to think how there were many diasporas before this sort of all-encompassing Greek diaspora. There was the diaspora of people from the islands of Kefalonia and others. There's the islands of Chios and many others in the Mediterranean that have their own small diasporas. So the interesting question, I guess, historically is the historical question is, when do these sort of small local diasporas become a Greek diaspora that many people conflate within the Mediterranean or the Black Sea and perhaps beyond? So that's one of the interesting questions. What is the position of and role of Greek ship owners and businessmen also in most cases or in all cases within this process? And I think that is an interesting thread that connects from the period of Ottoman rule that Molly Green mentioned all the way to the modern so-called period and the 20th and 21st century. And that has to do, based again on what Professor Charlafti has written and a few others, on the business strategies that people employed. So I think that's one interesting point, that, you know, Greeks have not sort of a timeless characteristic ability to navigate literally and metaphorically the business world of the time, within empires, within states, within faraway, unknown lands and ports in many cases. But they also seem to have an ability to build capacity to exploit the technologies of the time. And that's also quite interesting, I think, from the 19th to the 20th century. So technology, not just in a sort of scientific way simply, but also in, to use a term that global economic historians have been using for a while, of useful and reliable knowledge. So how do you do the most with what you have in a sort of consistent way that allows you not to be scientific as in a sort of Eurocentric way of experimentation and proliferation of, you know, dissemination of results, but rather of useful, what is useful and reliable to know and apply to improve the business, solve business problems, expand, and so on. Now, when it comes to the relationship between state and maritime history or state and the sea, I think that also needs to be historicized a little bit, because all the big empires, you know, the British Empire, for instance, had a huge maritime sector that it was basically built on. It was, you know, that is what explains to a large extent the expansion of the British Empire, you know, the commercial, but also the military navy. And as you both know, and perhaps many from our audience, the two were not exactly distinct for a long period of time. You know, when you look at not just in the Mediterranean, perhaps a bit later in the Mediterranean, but when you look at the Indian Ocean or the Caribbean in the 17th century, you know, who's a pirate and a corsair and a buccaneer? And, you know, they're all, you know, could be working for the British or the Spanish Empire in that respect. And, you know, I don't want to go to the discussion about piracy in the Mediterranean. You know, you're both extremely knowledgeable about this. But I would like to know what you think in what the position is of, you know, Greek merchants in all this, you know, in the transition from piracy, let's say, to a modern commerce. And one other thing that, you know, would probably take us to the modern era and a little bit more to the discussion of this cluster, which, if I may remind us, that it is about cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitics. You know, I think that for a long time, not anymore perhaps, there was this perception that, you know, merchants, and especially large merchants, are kind of inherently cosmopolitan. You know, that are kind of by definition almost, you know, if you're engaging in international commerce, then for you're cosmopolitan. And that in itself is an inherently good thing. I think we've kind of moved away a little bit from that, including the work of people like Will Handley, who, talking about Alexandria, if I remember, he came up with the term vulgar cosmopolitanism, trying to, you know, debunk the sense that, you know, only wealthy merchants are cosmopolitan, who probably not go very far in most cases, right? They're mostly based, and especially if they're older, you know, they're mostly based in one place. Not that lack of mobility prevents people from being cosmopolitan. I think, again, to talk about places that are more familiar to most of us, ports in the Mediterranean had these cosmopolitan spaces, whether it is a chamber of commerce, whether there are other sort of spaces of socialization as well as business, where cosmopolitanism could be practiced. I think but that doesn't mean that people, again, following Will Handley's points, there are people who are traveling around the Mediterranean, whether as merchants or sailors, could not be assumed to have a certain type of cosmopolitanism. You know, the polyglot merchants, but also sailors, of, you know, to refer to Molly Green's call for more studies of sailors. And finally, one last thing that takes us also to the relationship between the state, and particularly the Greek state, and tycoons in the, you know, to follow the title. I wonder whether, and I'm probably ignorant about this, and whether there are any studies, but is the propensity and large sector almost of Greek tycoons to engage in a philanthropic activities and charitable activities. Is it a Greek thing? Is it, the fact that you have nowadays cultural foundations that have completely changed the landscape in cultural production, in research to a certain extent? Is this a Greek thing? I mean, do other countries that have a large shipping tycoon sector, can they show a similar kind of cultural production and foundation, an organization, let's say, of cultural production similar to that of Greece? And how far back does it go? I mean, is it? I know the benevolence, of people like Marius Flaginis from Corfu, who went to Venice. He was one of the founders of the Venetian, of the Greek community there. And among other things, he, if I remember right, he started a fund for young boys from Corfu to study in Venice. And I think, that's back in the 16th century. So without, drawing too many connections and losing what happened in between, is this sort of in present day Greece and the cultural production that mostly, shipping foundations, cultural foundations of ship owners have, is this sort of a characteristic of Greece, or is it sort of representative of the sector as a whole? And I hope we'll have time to get back to more discussion about cosmopolitanism.
I have to be the bad guy here. The time is a very scarce resource in the colonized Hellas. We have 10 minutes. So this is not really my decision. I would really love the discussion. So can we promise that we share 5 minutes each of our two respondents for this? I know it's brutal, but this is all we have. So yeah, please.
Okay, can I go first? And I'll be 5 minutes. I promise, no more than that.
Thanks, Molly.
Yes, so for people out there who are contemplating a PhD, I would love to see a PhD, as Professor Charlafti said, of a village at sea. I think that would be a great study. And then the question that Professor Gkekas just put forward: how do we explain the benevolence of the Greek merchant and particularly shipping class? And does it have something, going back? I mean, I have thoughts on that. I won't go into them now because time is limited. But I think those are two great questions. Cosmopolitanism has, in Ottoman studies in particular, been heavily criticized. Yes, Will Hanley is one of them. It's been heavily criticized for several reasons. First, as historians, we like to pay attention to how people at the time, our actors, defined themselves, and no one ever defined themselves as cosmopolitanism. It wasn't a value that was held. It's something that we put on, and we think it's good. Khalid Fahmy has pointed out that epicenter of Alexandria, as it was entering into this period that people called cosmopolitanism, was also a time of brutal labor being demanded from the peasantry, from those who were not lucky enough to be in the cosmopolitan class, such as the digging of the canal that made Alexandria, that made it possible for Alexandria to grow as a port. We associate, we like cosmopolitanism because we associate it with being open and tolerant. That is not necessarily at all the case. You can travel around the world and be very intolerant. And Francesca Trivellato has pointed out what she calls the term communitarian cosmopolitanism, that what allowed Livorno to flourish, a city that was remarkably tolerant of Jews, that had Eastern Orthodox, that was a famously tolerant, it's always described that way, early modern port. People did business with each other and could do business with each other and wanted to do business with each other only if they knew which community you belonged to. Okay, this was not like, oh, we're all like, moving beyond community and we're, having drinks together. That was not at all the case. That commerce was facilitated by very strict communal belonging. So that's another. When do these small diasporas become bigger? That's really, really interesting. I would like to ask Professor Charlafti a question, and I don't know if it's fair to intrude on her 5 minutes, but I was thinking, one of the things I talk about with my students is in Mediterranean studies, there's this argument that why does the Mediterranean disappear in the 19th century? Why is it no longer a subject of study? And what they mean by that is that the Mediterranean, prior to the 19th century, the two shores were connected, west and east were connected. Then the Mediterranean does become colonized in the 19th century, meaning that outside powers, particularly the British, broke those traditional ties, right? So like today, you know, if you're in Crete, you can't take a ship, you know, you can't get on a ship and go to Alexandria, right? So the Mediterranean disappears in the 19th century, and there's this whole discussion about how the Mediterranean cannot be modern. And yet Professor Charlafti, and very correctly so empirically, is describing continuity when it comes to Greek shipping. So I would be fascinated, and I'm going to come to hear her thoughts on this late 18th to 19th century transition, which is so prominent, at least in writings about the Mediterranean, that somehow the Mediterranean we're all familiar with disappears at the end of the 18th century. But the Greek case sort of calls that into question. So I would love her comments on that, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Green. Professor Gelina?
Yes, it is not fair, Molly. We have to talk about this. I don't understand what you mean by Mediterranean disappearing, because it was steamship companies that did passenger shipping, and the Mediterranean was very much connected all the shores in the 19th century, and Panaiti strati to the interwar period, to the mid 19th century. And Panaiti Strati, as this Romanian Greek novelist, has written about all these men that were hopping from steamship to steamship illegally to go to Alexandria, take an Austrian Lloyd ship, go to Alexandria or to Napoli or to other places. So it is the airplane that disconnected the Mediterranean, okay? And that is not in the 19th century. 19th century, the Mediterranean was extremely connected. I'm sorry, I have to close that down, please. I'm sorry about this. Okay. But we'll talk about this. It's very interesting. Diaspora of big merchants, trading companies. I'm talking about huge trading companies, Raleigh Brothers, 1810 to 1962, 20,000 workers in India, right? This is a huge trading company called British Trading Company by Jeffrey Jones. But up to 1950s, all the big managers come from Chios or from Kefalonia or from Corfu. They are chosen Greek. You know, so why is that? We have to see that. And in the 20th century, our big diaspora capitalists are the ship owners. Okay, this is what is very important. And it is not only ship owners, Sakis. It is the big the tycoons. And when we're talking about tycoons, Valiano brothers, just captains that did not speak but Greek, whether in Russia or in London or Marseille, they left with money of today's money, 2 billion 200 million euros. Okay, and Onassis left about 2.5 billion euros of today's money. So it is equivalent. So we are talking about tycoons, and Valiano left a huge sort of foundation in Kefalonia that was the social security of Kefalonia. So philanthropy. These were the. It was they were called. You know very well. There were big robber barons. They were called. You know, Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and so on. They all did huge foundations, but it is it's not I mean and in Greece all the Dromokaitis, large merchant in Marseille, Goulandris, Tsigros, all the of course Niarchos and Onassis. So it is just the big money that they I think there's a whole sort of, there's quite a lot of literature about philanthropy and the aftermath that they want to leave a legacy, okay? So I think I've covered have probably 1 minute, but I think that's enough. Oh yes, and I will finish with innovation. Greeks invented, I mean, my last book on the Valianos and Onassis indicates the various innovations, which is not, as you rightly put it, Sakis, in technology, it is also in business practices. So the model that it is used today by all shipping companies in the world was invented by Greeks mainly, and by Onassis particularly, and a group of Greeks at that time in the 1940s and 1950s, okay? These were the new men, the new tanker men that replaced the old British shipping elite, okay? In carrying new cargoes in a new, more globalized world that needed oil. So they invented, others have made cars or lab or computers or pharmaceuticals. We're good in ships. So, and dealing with the sea. And it is, and this will be my last sentence, cosmopolitanism and the islands and shipping. Okay, people from Greek islands left and went to and visited 20 or 30 ports in 1 year. Talked, the simple seaman would be able to communicate in 5 or 6 languages. Okay, when many shipping or maritime places stopped being shipping maritime places, like Mykonos or Santorini, then all the world came to these islands, okay? Now, how we have to discuss about cosmopolitanism in another conference, Nikolas, and I'm very happy for this discussion today. Thank you very much, all of you.
Yeah, it was wonderful to be able to talk about these big ideas with the two of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, yeah, for me too, and thank you, Nikolas, and the team of Decolonize Hellas.
Thank you, Sakis, and thank you all. Thank you, Professor Green, Molly from Princeton. Thank you, Gelina, Professor Charlafti from Crete, and Sakis, Professor Gkekas from York. This, as we said at the beginning, was only an effort to scratch the surface of this vast topic, but I think we did it as best as we could with the best people in the field. We have many open questions out there. You know, if decolonizing and colonialism in general fits in as a category, does it add as a question to understand better Greek shipping or not? These are only very preliminary questions that we hope to take up again in the next iteration. But for now, unfortunately, we have to stop here. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for participating, and hoping that this will open the appetite for another bigger panel and a longer panel on cosmopolitanism at sea, diasporas, and philanthropy, and many other topics that are still to be discovered. Thank you so much, and have a good continuation, because we continue with another panel today, and a great keynote speech at 9 with Professor Mamdani from Columbia University. Thanks.